Hello, I'm Craig Vogley, CEO of Gulf Photonics, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our AccuBrew webinar. Joining me today are Vice President of Engineering, Christopher Bailey, our Manager of Embedded Systems, Bradley Fernandez, our Business Development Manager, Andrew Parker, and our special guest, Kelly Meyer, author and podcaster of How Not to Start a Damn Brewery. Before we get into the details of our AccuBrew product, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the history of our company. Founded in 1996 by Patrick Bennett, Gulf Fiber Optics is an FDA-registered medical device manufacturing company. Gulf Fiber Optics produces fiber optic assemblies for surgery, spine, endoscopy, and also produces surgical headlights and medical device light sources. Our Gulf Photonics company, in addition to our AccuBrew products, designs and produces optical fiber assemblies for various industries such as spaceflight, defense, aerospace, R&D, agriculture, and medical. Needless to say, being around for almost 30 years, we're not going anywhere. Again, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I hope you find it insightful. Welcome to AccuBrew.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you for coming. My name is Parker. I'm the business development lead and boots on the ground for the AccuBrew system. I visit your breweries. Before managing the tap room, tasting room, and brewery, I was in the food packaging industry building custom machines for companies like Procter & Gamble, General Mills, and RJR Tobacco. My background in the food industry made joining the AccuBrew team a no-brainer. In the food industry, every batch is monitored. They employ microbiologists working in state-of-the-art labs, making hundreds of tests every day. Many of the breweries you compete with are now doing the same. AccuBrew helps give you a competitive advantage without the degrees at a fraction of the cost. So what is the AccuBrew system? The AccuBrew system consists of a visible light sensor, mobile apps, and a web portal that help you stay connected to your brewery, communicate with your team and collaborators, share data, set reminders and alerts, and record process notes to build, preserve, and protect institutional memory. The unique visible light sensor monitors gravity, fermentation activity, clarity, and temperature, giving brewers a view of the fermentation process never before seen that no other sensor provides. So what makes AccuBrew better? The AccuBrew team you are about to meet started with a clear set of goals: monitor every tank, every batch, and design an affordable sensor that can survive production breweries, survive washdown, CIP, and a zero maintenance sensor that never needs calibration and never needs batteries. AccuBrew isn't just better because of what we do. We are better because of what we help you do. Again, monitor every tank, every batch affordably. This requirement led to an innovative subscription plan. No contracts, no tiers, no limits, no ads, and subscriptions can be paused on demand to reduce costs during the off-season. That's the AccuBrew system in a nutshell. So now let me introduce you to our design team leads, Chris Bailey and Bradley Fernandez. Thank you.
Thank you, Parker. Hello, everybody. My name is Brad Fernandez, and I am the Embedded Systems Manager for the AccuBrew Fermentation Monitoring System. Today, I would like to introduce you to our hardware, which consists of the sensor and the power supply. The body of the sensor is a robust stainless steel body. It comes with a 1.5-inch tri-clamp mount, which makes it easy to mount in fermentation vessels. It also includes an acrylic faceplate, which combined with the IP69K leak-proof connector allows it to easily be washed down and foamed without any issues. We also include a power supply. The power supply includes a 120-volt transformer, which supplies a low voltage 5-volt supply to the device itself. This includes a 10-meter food grade cable, which also includes a IP69K waterproof connector. Next, we have the electronics. The electronics were designed here in the USA in sunny Oldsmar, Florida. First up, we have the Wi-Fi enabled microprocessor. This is what makes our device an IoT device. This allows us to connect to the internet and send data to and from the cloud at any time. This also makes it very easy for us to push over-the-air updates to the device, so the brewer doesn't have to worry about SD cards and updating the device or anything like that. We also have a 1800 milliamp hour battery backup. This allows the device to continue taking readings even if you lose power in the brewery. It also comes with a memory backup, which this allows us to collect data even if we lose a connection to the internet. The device will continue to collect data, store it on the memory, and when you get internet back, it will then allow it to download it and make it available via the app. Also included is a full visible white LED that is low power and does not include any infrared or ultraviolet, so you don't have to worry about your beer becoming light struck or anything like that. This combined with a MEMS light sensor is what allows us to receive the signal back and read the changes over time. Lastly, the device also includes a digital temperature sensor. This digital temperature sensor is very accurate to within plus or minus 0.1 degrees Celsius. It's also a digital temperature sensor, so it's very reliable and you don't have to worry about any calibration. And that's pretty much it. It's simple. That is the overview of the hardware for the AccuBrew fermentation monitoring system. With that, I'm going to hand you over to Christopher Bailey, our Vice President of Engineering, and he's going to go over the user interface.
Hello everyone, I'm Christopher Bailey, VP of Engineering here with AccuBrew. I'm going to follow up Bradley's discussion and Parker's discussion with some general features about our user interface, which consists of the mobile apps and the web app, and then we're going to transition into kind of defining what our 4 measurement parameters are. We'll just kind of get started and we'll talk a little bit about the mobile apps and the web app. AccuBrew has an intuitive user interface. We intentionally tried to keep it as clean, as simple, and as easy to navigate as possible. We used as many sort of UI features that we could that people are used to seeing in other apps that would work with our app. It's essentially data management, right? So there are some things that you all will have seen before in other apps, and so that should make things easy for you. So AccuBrew's system, as Parker and Bradley told you, is there's a software component, there's a hardware component, and then there's the server component, right? And so the firmware on the hardware that Bradley described speaks to our backend servers and our machine learning prediction server, and then displays that information via the mobile apps and the web apps. So the mobile app is the most full-featured example at this point, where you are able to purchase devices, manage the subscriptions to those devices, and manage users as well. So our subscription model is one where we allow you to pause any device whenever you want. So if, say you are in the Great White North and you have a really slow season for 3 or 4 months and you're going to go down to like 25% brewing capacity, you can jump into the app, pause those sensors, and continue on with whichever ones you're going to use during the off season. And also using that app, you manage commands to the sensors, right? So say you brew a batch, you pitch your yeast. So what you'll do is you'll log into the app after you've claimed your sensors, and you'll hit that little play button to start a run, right? And then a survey will pop up, and it will ask for the batch name. It will ask some parameters like starting gravity, final gravity, how long the fermentation is going to take, and then you'll hit confirm, and then the sensor will immediately start to take data, right? So it'll take an initial reading, and then every 15 minutes after that, it's going to take another set of readings. And the firmware on the device sends that information up into the cloud. Some computing is done, some calculations, and then the results are sent to the user interfaces, whether that's the mobile app or the web app. So then you see your 4 parameters, your predicted gravity, your fermentation profile, your clarity, and your temperature. And with that data, you are able to keep a close eye on your batch wherever you are and whenever you are. And some of the most important features as we approach this app, because we are medical device manufacturers, we keep a lot of records, right? And some of them are paper records. Not all of them are paper records. Anything we can get in an electronic format so that we can store it in a central location, then we know that if we're tracking this particular parameter, we can go back and leverage that to make sure that we don't have process drift, right? And that's sort of what we were thinking here. And so that's why we have a feature that we call the brew book, right? So a brew book is where you should store all process notes about your batch. Whether that's the day you pitched, the day you dry hopped, the day you decided to make a temperature change, or even if you notice that, my temperature seems a little bit off on this batch compared to other batches, log in there, record that observation, and then you will have that sort of in perpetuity. So then you can leverage that information to improve your processes, right? And then as part of the brew book, we also have reminders, right? So if you're the brewery manager, but you're not going to be on site for a couple of weeks, and you want to make sure that your assistant brewers or whoever's watching the shop for you does things at a particular time on a particular day, you set a reminder, and whoever is assigned to that batch or assigned to that sensor will get a push notification saying, hey, do this, dry hop, whatever, change the temp, start your crash. And then you have a record that push was sent, so you know that process step has always been done at the same time or when you wanted it to be done. That's a critical component, right? It helps with delegation, it helps with oversight, and it helps with process management. A feature that ties into that is the team messaging that's built into the app, right? It protects employee privacy, it consolidates and archives all of your employee communication. So that also becomes a part of your historical record. You can also set thresholds for your specific gravity and your temperature. So if you've got a known terminal, right, and you say, okay, when the gravity gets to this value, send me a push notification so that I know that it's time to crash or pump out or whatever. And also you have some other issue with temperature management. You will get an alert that says, hey, this temperature is outside of your upper or lower threshold. You might want to take a look at things. And those alerts come every 15 minutes, right? So then those also become a part of your historical record. So every alert that gets sent via the UI and the software goes into your batch report that you are able to export and print. So you can also give logins to collaborators. So say you're brewing a batch with a brewery down the street or across town or halfway across the state, you can create a login for them, and they are able to also keep track of that collaboration brew at the same time. So if they notice anything that seems a little bit different than what they were expecting, they can pop into the message board, and say, hey, can you guys take a look? That kind of thing. We don't limit the number of users you can have. So if you have 3 AccuBrew sensors and you want 10 people to have access to each one of those, you can have 30 users. There's access levels, right? So there's the admin, there's manager, and there's production, and there's collaborator, right? So production would be a brewer, or an assistant brewer if your manager's your brewer. So it's the crux basically of what the UI is. It is the management interface to the sensors, and that allows you to display and interpret your data anywhere, anytime, no matter where you are. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about what we actually measure. So, the 4 parameters that get served up to the user interface. So the predicted gravity, the fermentation profile, the clarity, and the temperature. I think, temperature makes sense to everyone, right? So we probably won't talk too much about that. Predicted gravity profile is a visible record of the gravity predictions made during fermentation. So you may notice that we don't call it a specific gravity, we call it a predicted gravity, right? So the sensor every 15 minutes collects 18 points of data. All that data gets sent up to the cloud, and then we use our machine learning server to churn all that data and spit out a predicted specific gravity value, and that is what you see in the user interface. So that's great, but it's best when used in conjunction with the fermentation profile and the clarity. Later in the presentation, when Bradley comes back up, we'll talk about sort of how to use the predicted gravity and the fermentation profile and the clarity together to help determine what is actually going on in your process. Fermentation profile is a relative record of total sugars in solution, both fermentable and non-fermentable. We leverage the fact that sugars like to absorb blue light, right? So we measure the change over time and the amount of blue light returned to our sensor, right? So if we fire up our LED and we don't get any blue light returned, we know that there are still a lot of sugars present, right? And as those sugars start to get consumed, we get more blue light returned to the sensor, and that is how we build our fermentation profile model. Clarity is really kind of unique to our system, right? So clarity is a measure of particles passing in front of the sensor window in solution, right? So we get this convection, right? And say your AccuBrew sensor's here, you're gonna see all this stuff that rises or falls in front of the window, right? And early in fermentation, when things start kicking up, you're gonna get a lot of activity, right? And then, spikes indicate a less clear solution and dips indicate a more clear solution, right? So you'll see throughout the fermentation process, right? You get lag, it's really kind of clear, and then as things start to kick off, you get this big spike, and then we kind of maintain for a little bit, and as sort of striation layers in your fermentation settle out, you'll see those pass in front of the window and you'll get a big spike and then you'll get a drop as we get through that final layer of that. So that's really clarity, and clarity, it'll make more sense to you when you see the graphs combined with the predicted gravity and the fermentation profile as sort of a total picture of what is happening. Because predicted gravity is a pretty gradual rate of change measurement, right? There's not a lot of dynamic changes there. But the fermentation profile and the clarity, you will see a lot of changes that you probably wouldn't expect. Because even when you are at your final gravity, you're still going to get settling, right? You're still going to see some extraction from things that are in your brew, and so it will be interesting to you based on these definitions what you can infer when we see the data in a few minutes. Okay, that wraps up our discussion regarding user interface and what we measure. I appreciate you joining us today, and thank you for your time.
Hello, Christopher. I want to talk about our data and how to interpret it a little bit with one of our batches today.
Yeah, let's do a little comparison.
Probably some of the West Coast IPAs are good to view for this. We've brewed this quite a few times, so we're intimately familiar with the data and what it represents. Let me go, that was A. Let me open the 7B. 7B, here we go. Everyone should kind of have an understanding of what it is that AccuBrew measures, but just as a refresher, so this green graph is your predicted specific gravity. This blue graph is our fermentation profile. So this is, general sugars overview based on the relationship between blue light and sugars. Sugars absorb blue light. So we'll cover that a little bit in additional detail when we talk about the data. Our clarity profile, which is a really powerful tool for sort of inferring activity and process stage, and we'll cover that a little bit. And then temperature, everyone knows what temperature is, right? So this is a West Coast IPA that we brewed to test and build our machine learning algorithm. And you can see kind of Bradley's process notes and reminders. So you can see the amount of yeast that Bradley pitched, and then what we did for our dry hop on the 28th here. All right, so specific gravity, so this is what you would normally expect to see, a nice gradual incremental change between your starting gravity and your ending gravity. Fermentation profile. So, and Bradley, if you kind of want to outline what we see early on here and sort of what this trend line is showing us, and then we can review the clarity and then come back to the top and talk about our dry hop data.
Firstly, can you scroll back up to fermentation profile?
This is
standard
SG. Yep.
So one of the things I wanted to point out here is that it is the general, SG measurement that pretty much every brewer's used to, whether it's Plato or SG, it's your standard gravity. Um, what I want to point out here is this is 96 gravity readings per day. So this is what brewers are used to seeing as far as specific gravity, but in a way that's a lot more inclusive and a lot more data points. So this
Much
is really
higher
giving you,
resolution. Yeah.
yes, much higher resolution. So this is giving you an actual fermentation curve that you can then use to do side-by-side comparisons, which, in this chart, we can already see that we're picking up things, peaks and stuff, as far as that we'll get back to as far as the dry hopping, that typically brewers would not see, right? So they might have one at the very beginning, maybe one or two in the middle, and then one at the very end. But as far as this curves, peaks, valleys, all that stuff, they would not normally get. So I just wanted to point that out, firstly, for the specific gravity or for the gravity measurements. And then our next measurement, we'll go back to the fermentation profile.
Yeah, and another thing to consider when talking about the frequency of measurements is that these fluctuations. I mean, you wouldn't typically think about the gravity going up a couple of points and then going back down a couple of points. But the way that this measurement works is, the sensor has a window on the front, and everything that passes in front of it gets measured over time, right? So that's why there are some, a lot more peaks and valleys than you would normally expect to see, because you're not always just measuring a completely filtered, completely degassed small volume of liquid. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, all right, fermentation profile. We touched on this a little bit. This is the relationship of the blue light that our sensor outputs and sugars in general. So go ahead, Bradley, take it over.
Okay, so on this one, you'll see, again, like you were saying, this is a general chemistry measurement. So this is going to show changes in the chemistry of the actual solution that SG is not going to be able to see. So if you scroll back up just a little bit real quick to show the standard gravity again, we get our real high, we get a drop, and then towards the end, it levels out. So this does give us what our SG is and what the gravity is doing, but it doesn't really tell the whole story. By looking at the fermentation profile, we can glean that there's something still going on in that fermentation, even after the gravity has changed from the sugars being changed to alcohol. So we can see there's a little bit of activity in the very beginning, probably just after we pitched our yeast. So that's going to show some chemical changes from the introduction of the yeast. Then we stay fairly level as far as the chemical change for a large majority of the beginning portion of the fermentation. We know that the gravity is changing, right? But clearly we're seeing that something is staying fairly level till, after the majority of our fermentation has ended. Then after the majority of our fermentation ends, we can see a big drop. And then, the movement here that's related to our dry hop. Yep. So we're going to see, fermentation has had pretty much ended, and then we have a pretty good drop. So that's implying that there are other chemical changes in the solution that are happening. Why is that important? Well, for consistency's sake, this might be something that we want to ensure happens every time, or something that we want to prevent from happening every time. So with the use of this data and some tasting data, some actual, in-house tasting measurements, we can glean, what is the right path to take. Are we improving our beer, or are we making our beer worse? So this additional data is really important for that. Yeah, fermentation profile is general chemistry. So this will actually show you other things in solution changing, which is, again, it is important. And it's something that brewers have never had an insight into before. So that's one of the things we want to impress upon the brewers, that just because you've never seen it before doesn't mean it's not important. And there is a lot of information there to be used for consistent beer production.
Yeah, and it's important to point out also that across batch to batch of the same beer, these profiles will all fit generally really well together. And I'm not a brewer; I'm just kind of an engineer. But this next measurement that we do, the clarity measurement, for me, is kind of the most telling thing. Um, I'm able to tell a lot about where Bradley is in the process just based on our clarity data. And when we tie this clarity data in with this fermentation profile data, for me, I'm able to really get an idea of how the fermentation has progressed, how activity has been in general, like if things happened when we expected them to happen, and if they lasted for as long as we expected them to last. And you can just tell visually, how dynamic, the clarity is compared to the specific gravity and the fermentation profile. All right, so for this clarity, Bradley, let's just kind of go through and talk about this in segments. I think in other conversations we've had, you like to talk about the anaerobic and stages, and along with the lag phase and those kind of things. So if you kind of want to outline, the early stages of fermentation, and then we can discuss, the middle stages, and then we can follow that up with talking about the dry hop data.
Okay. So we'll kind of just go over the quick little areas here. So in the very beginning, right before the second peak, yep, this is going to be our lag phase, and then beginning to come out of our lag phase. One of the things that's important with our setup is we do about 1 2-gallon batch per week for our sampling setup. And I usually brew on one day, and then it goes into the fridge, and it's allowed to settle overnight typically. And then once it's settled overnight, I'll pitch the following day. So in these beers, specifically this West Coast IPA, it actually has it's fairly clear, which means it has a low amount of particulate in the solution. So you'll see this beer starts fairly low as far as, not a lot of stuff in solution. And then once we've pitched our yeast, with this one specifically, it was a dry yeast. So I just sprinkled on top of the solution. So then it rehydrates and then will fall into the solution. Yep. So there you go, 11.5 a gram of safe air. So this beginning portion, you'll see we went from a very low amount of particulate. Then we have a small peak, and then a sudden really, really big peak. And then it kind of drops down almost back to the same level, and then gradually works up to the large peak. And in this case specifically, what we're seeing is what we're seeing is the yeast that got sprinkled on top, hydrating, then falling. So we'll see this activity, you'll see our particulate goes up, and then eventually it's going to fall past the sensor, which then we have the valley to the left of where you're at, Chris, the valley below it. Yep, right there. And then as that yeast starts to actually be in its lag phase, which is the aerobic phase, it's going to pick up oxygen, reproduce, and then start fermenting. So we can literally see, here's our absorption of water. It falls. We can see it falling past the sensor. Okay, it's probably all down on the bottom now. And then we can see it reproducing, kicking off, and starting that fermentation. Which is really good information, right? We've never really been able to see the actual yeast change real time, how and what is going on inside of the fermentation. Then after
and
that,
it's important to, while we're thinking about this, so if this amplitude over time changes drastically, then you have less healthy yeast or not as much fermentable sugars in solution as you might have had the first time around, right? So if this is a much more gradual rise, then that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at this data as well?
Absolutely. A big one with that is sometimes we use dry yeast and sometimes we use liquid yeast, depending on what's available at our local homebrew shop. And you will definitely see those amplitudes and how that reaction happens in the beginning being different based on whether it's a dry yeast or a liquid yeast. So same thing, maybe yeast health is starting to suffer a bit, and maybe that starts to be lengthened out further and further from batch to batch. So that is a good indicator of things like yeast health. Did I do something weird with temperature? I mean, any of that. It's a good,
And
actionable data to lead back to issues.
yeah, we so on these test batches that Bradley does for us to build out our data sets, we will actually use different pitch rates from time to time for the same beer. And we do that for a couple of different reasons, right? So that we can actually make sure that we are able to capture that change in amplitude over time, and to also try to confuse the predictive gravity value. So we have seen this over and over again. And it's really kind of interesting to me how similar a fingerprint all these beers will have after we've brewed them 8, 9, or 10 times.
Yeah, it definitely has caught me by surprise a few times where we do a side-by-side comparison. I'm like, wow, those are almost exactly the same. And these are completely, they're the same style of beer and the same recipe, but they've been brewed at different times. So I wouldn't expect them to be that close. And that's one of the reasons that I continually point out to brewers that this is a good indicator of consistency. If this is the same every single time, that beer is as close to being the same as you can get it.
All right. So, what would we call this phase, Brad?
So I would say that's just the settling out phase. So right before that, we have this area between our two peaks, and that seems to be where the majority of the fermentation happens. So kind of go to the middle of that area, Chris, a little bit to the left.
Here?
Yeah, ish there. Yep. And then can you just scroll up to where the SG is, so we can kind of compare. So you'll see, so you can see a majority of the fermentation, we're down by maybe 1025 from where we were at 1055. So we're down a good 30 points at the middle of that fermentation. So by the time we get to where that secondary peak was, it looks like the majority of fermentation has pretty much wrapped up. So this third high peak here looks to me like, okay, the yeast has pretty much finished. Now it's going to start flocculating and falling out of suspensions. So I would assume this is kind of your flocculation stage. Everything's pretty much done with the fermentation. You have a little bit more fermentation to go as far as sugar and alcohol, and then whatever other chemical changes that are critical for this style of beer. So that would be, I would say, flocculation stage there.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because we use clear fermenters, right? Obviously, and then to actually be able to go look at the fermenter, and see those striations and verify that those are settling out of solution in a very homogeneous way, which is why you get, a sudden uptick, over 45 minutes. So these 3 data points, I mean, this is, 45 minutes on the clock. And then, you've got all this settling passing in front of the window. And then, how gradual it is after that. And then after we talk about dry hop, I'll pull up another one of these batches and we can do a little comparison there. So,
awesome.
Temperature, that everyone, kind of knows what this is. There's some interesting action here with the dry hop that we'll talk about. So if we check out these notes, we can see Bradley hopped 32 grams worth of stuff here.
Correct.
And it looks like you did that on the 28th.
Yep.
So you created these reminders for you. So it's interesting, we get, as soon as you drop your bag in and your weight to hold the bag down, you immediately get this little uptick in density. And it's important to think about that in terms of the way that the sensor works, right? Because it's essentially a camera. It's going to inspect everything that passes in front of it. And if when it happened to be taking a measurement, something that Bradley dry hopped passing in front of it, it's measuring all of that particulate, not just the liquid that's surrounding it. So there's the initial hop, and you can see in this fermentation profile when we're talking about the general chemistry and the sugars and whatever else might be in those hops that are affecting the blue light output, and also some of the other outputs, because this is a ratio of blues to some of the other colors. So as the initial reaction of the solution to the hops being placed in the bag, you get these density changes and then these general chemistry changes. And then from a clarity standpoint, which makes the most sense because this is the visual record of particulate in solution, you get the largest peak here as particulates pass in front of the window. What was really interesting to me is the temperature correction based on what you dry hopped. So you didn't put a lot of mass in. I guess as a percentage of the whole, it's more than you would typically see in a brewery, but it's kind of unique to our setup. So then we get this little lag area where the hops are probably absorbing liquid, right, and starting to excrete, or the liquid starting to draw chemical compounds out of them. And then Bradley, if you want to talk about that in the fermentation profile a little bit, and I'll try to keep the clarity graph on screen as well, so we can kind of draw conclusions with both of them together.
Yeah, so fermentation profile, again, this is why this one is such a good measurement and gives the brewers insight where they have not seen before. We're actually able to see the extraction of the hop compounds from the hop into the liquid. So we can actually see these peaks and valleys, and one of the neat things is we can kind of get an idea of, okay, this started at the 28th and it ran through, it looks like about the 1st, till we get the tail end of the jumping around and it starts to level back out again. So this is, depending on the brewer, this could be critical to them for getting something out of a tank, right? If they, for example, normally would sit on their hops for 5 days, you're actually able to use data. Here, look, here you go. We're not getting that change anymore. You're not extracting anything from the hops at this point. If you're not seeing any other changes that are important to you, you do not have to wait an additional 2 days to go ahead and wrap that into the next tank. So this gives you actionable data to make a decision to move that beer and know that it's going to be consistent and have the flavors in it that you want. This also works well like with cocoa nibs. Again, you'll see a change in the response of the fermentation profile, and eventually it will level out, and you'll know, okay, look, we're not making any chemical changes in this beer anymore. There's no reason to wait any longer on these cocoa nibs. We can go ahead and rack and move on to the next step.
I think you've mentioned this before, like this clarity graph is, to me, the most interesting measurement because it's the most dynamic. And then, you can see kind of what I was talking about in the temperature here. I mean, 32 grams of hops isn't a lot of mass. Your weight that you use probably had a little bit to do with that. But, that all of this will sort of affect the final profile of your beer. So that's important to think about, and being able to even, see this like you've never seen it before. As you brew the same beer over and over and over again, you will build up your historical data, and you can, compare every single batch and see, if you made small process changes, if that helped, or if it made things worse based on your taste testing that you do at the end. So how about I open up one of the other IPA batches and see how the data compares a little bit. Yeah, let's go with the 7A here. Okay, so specific gravity, right off the bat, you can see very similar profiles. Things progressed a little bit slower on this batch 7A compared to the first one, but you also see you have a little more hectic data here going on with the dry hop compared to the first one. Yeah, so the difference in amplitude over time on this fermentation profile graph makes sense as well. When you think about them in terms of this, so things didn't progress as quickly on this 07A as maybe they did on the B, and you're able to see the difference in what we mean by amplitude is sort of the height, and then over time is the distance. That's one of the ways that we compare things here. And even in the beginning of this fermentation, Bradley, if you look at this fermentation data, this looks like this 7A wasn't nearly as well settled out as the 7B was. There's a lot more particulate in here that the sensor's measuring. This 30 graph, right? So what you were talking about here with your lag phases, these are really close to identical between one or the other. And so looking at this blue, right? So this is the second batch that we thought maybe didn't ferment as quickly. And you can see we have sort of this sawtooth pattern here with kind of the lag phase and then a drop out and much less amplitude in terms of action. So this would be your anaerobic phase, you were calling it, Bradley?
Yes, anaerobic. So, yep.
Yeah, so there's a lot less activity there in comparison. And that would probably explain why it didn't ferment as quickly.
It's a possibility, right? That could be a possible indicator to yeast issues.
Yeah, our temperatures. This one was a little bit colder, right? Maybe that had something to do with things not kicking off as quickly or as efficiently as in the other batch.
And that specifically, we did at a certain point change our temp controllers so that it tightened up our swing as far as how many degrees we go. So this is a perfect example of where maybe a brewer made a change and they noticed a difference in their beer. And if they were making tasting notes and adding them to this batch, they would actually be able to then go back and look and see, oh, I have a difference in flavor. Let me try to narrow down what this issue was. And with this data, it's pretty clear that this one fermenter had a lot more swing and was getting a lot cooler. So like you're saying, that's a possibility that maybe this temp sensor was set to be too cold and that was missed and made it through the cracks. But with this data, we're able to immediately do a side-by-side comparison and fairly quickly figure out, okay, look, we had a little bit of a temperature issue. We need to pay closer attention to that on our next batch.
Yeah, and if you only have your temperature data, right, and you only have your SG data, there's not a lot of information you're going to get from that, right? But if you look at this data as a whole, right, you see slower fermentation in the fermentation profile and in the SG, and then you see less amplitude over time here, and then you put that together with your temperature. I mean, that's how you sort of build out these footprints, fingerprints, and you can infer process issues based on that data. So it's important to look at the four measurements that we make as a whole and not use them as standalone values, because by themselves they don't really tell that much of a story as compared to when they're being used together and leveraged as a whole. So
absolutely.
Yeah, and this is interesting as well on these. So it's possible that this sensor here was picking up a bit more of the true pile towards the end of the fermentation than the other one. And that would explain why it appears that this has so much more suspended particulate in it. It would also make sense that, we're seeing, a different chemistry profile based on what we're measuring. So yeah, there's a little bit of an SG difference there as well. So, I mean, that's That's a little bit more deeper dive into, what this data is and how kind of Bradley and I use it at the shop. Bradley more so than me, but I think the clarity's, pretty kind of incredible about what it can show us about the process. And with this data and with accurate batch notes, you'll be able to compare and leverage that data into being as efficient and as consistent as you can.
Absolutely, and like you said, I think the notes is a big part of it. Adding anything you can in there, yeast counts, tasting notes, anything like that is going to give you the ability to troubleshoot easier down the road, rather than pulling out brew sheets and hoping that you have some good data on there. You can immediately do a side-by-side comparison with a reading being taken every 15 minutes. For example, if you go back to that down to the temperature one, the typical brewer would not have the insight into the swings that are happening with the IPA 07A, right? They might have a temperature written on a brew sheet, but the ability to see the actual swings over the course of the day and over the course of an hour is way more useful and actionable than just taking a thermometer reading every once in a while, or never taking it and just setting it and moving on with what you need to do.
Yeah, and it's possible every time you walk by this thermometer, it says 68 degrees, right?
Yep.
But that means you're missing all those data points that you didn't happen to walk by the thermometer at that time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Important note too is, like Bradley was saying with your tasting notes, even if you finish this batch and it's not fermenting anymore and the run's been stopped, you can still come in and add tasting notes or any kind of finish notes or anything like that you'd like to add, or even any post fermentation process notes you want to add. So that's a good critical part of the system as well. So,
Absolutely.
anything else you want to add in closing, Bradley?
No, I think that's it. I think we pretty much covered, the ability to use the data and to make better, more consistent beer.
I agree. All right. Thanks for your time, Bradley.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, everybody.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Bailey, engineer with AccuBrew. To my right is Bradley Fernandez, and further to my right is Andrew Parker, our business development guy. And joining us today is Kelly Meyer, the host of the How to Not Start a Damn Brewery podcast and esteemed author. We're going to have a little panel discussion today and talk about some yet to be determined things. So should be fun.
I don't know. I think one of the obvious places to start is just kind of the idea of like, what in the hell inspired this great piece of technology?
Well, from my point of view, I was working with the golf team, doing some assembly and stuff, and I spotted a Raspberry Pi on Craig's desk. And I questioned Craig, like, oh, what are you guys using this Raspberry Pi? Because I was already a home brewer, and I was using Raspberry Pis to actually control temperatures in fridges and stuff, to control, my fermentations. And I asked them, and they said that they were developing, some kind of sensor for it. And I questioned, what would it be able to do beer? And he was like, I wonder if it could. And so that was basically the inspiration from that point to continue on for fermentation monitoring specifically. So, it was kind of their business acumen and the photonic stuff they were already doing, and my interest in home brewing and being able to not manually have to take, gravity readings.
Yeah, it's sort of, what our core business is manufacturing and engineering and design. And we take a lot of data and we leverage a lot of data to improve our processes. And being an FDA registered manufacturing facility, we, as painful as it is sometimes to assimilate into that sort of record keeping, it really does help you become a more efficient and better manufacturer. So brewing is manufacturing, and in the plainest sense, even though it's viewed as an art sometimes, but, so we thought, well, how can we help small to medium-sized breweries that don't have a lab, that don't have quality staff, start to start taking data and measuring things so that they can track them long term and start to leverage those inputs into process improvements, at an affordable price point and easily scalable from 1 to 10.
Yeah, and I think we'll get to that point with like really digging into what the advantages are and think what all it can do. I always think it's interesting just to look at basically the concept is that you can stand anywhere in the world and get information and data about existing fermentation and just whatever's in the tank sent to you directly to your phone, to your computer, wherever you are. But I know everyone that's listening has probably got all this technology already, but since Parker, since you're really ridiculously, overwhelmingly old, can you tell us what it used to be like in the Stone Ages, how you would have to test that same gravity and those same things that this product can do?
Yeah, every brewer knows they've got a clipboard hanging on a tank somewhere. And if you're lucky, maybe you get 10 gravity tests in the course of a fermentation, unless you come in on the weekends. Maybe you're doing 2 a day and you get a few more. And that keeps you aware of what's going on to some degree. I mean, things aren't stopping. Maybe they're proceeding well. But it's, the data then gets put on a shelf and it's really not accessible after that. And when I first met Pat, the owner of the company, he was my customer across the bar. And he mentioned what they were doing. This was probably 6-7 years ago now. And that was just an immediate, I was like, makes total sense. It's going to have 96 measurements every day without you doing anything. And not only that, it puts the data from last week, last year, 5 years ago, at your fingertips to be compared, overlaid, to make sure that what you're doing today is the same as it was a year ago, regardless of all the changes you might have been forced to make with different grain bills, or you needed to, maybe now you're not pitching fresh yeast every time, now you're finally propagating yeast. And there was really no way to ensure that am I really, my gravity hit a similar point 3 days in, but were those curves exactly following each other? And how am I going to make sure that any changes that I've been forced to make to the process, which we all know happen, are yielding a similar result in efficiencies, not just sensory.
And it's not the 1700s anymore, right? So we don't have to manually do it with a hydrometer.
Well, no, so you use the term hydrometer. I would actually say that is probably should be called the most fragile piece of equipment in a brewery. I cannot tell you how many of those I broke. And I'm a little lazier, a little bit more in a hurry, but they are remarkably fragile considering what they are and how imperative they are to the success or failure of the beer you're brewing. It's mind-boggling.
Well, coming from the food industry, where that thing wouldn't even be allowed in the same building. There's no glass allowed in those facilities at all, anywhere. And when I got into the brewing industry and saw this glass around everything, I was just like, I couldn't even believe it, and it was very strange to me. And the other devices are really not much more accurate, and they're just about as fragile. I mean, you take an Easy Dins and knock it off a step, and that's done for the day. So it's certainly a different world now, where the device these guys have designed is, you could slug it out with some zombies. So it's a whole different matter now.
Zombie Brewing Incorporated.
It is.
So the other thing I think that is fascinating to me about the whole concept of what it does is that it allows you to really see repeatability and dial into what you're doing. And so again, we talked about back when I had a brewery, it was a million years ago, and I had to use this very untechnological and breakable equipment. But even with that, I could see same brew day, same temperatures, same water influx, and still you wind up with a different beer slightly at the end. And sometimes that's within a range, sometimes not. But Brad, I had a question for you. How many times have you tested it and the same beer, and what kind of range did you get?
So the same beer, I think the most I've brewed a specific batch is 4 times at this point, because we're trying to collect a range of data. And the range that I see from, it's probably, at the most, maybe like 8 points of gravity. And usually I'm within 1 or 2. I'm usually pretty consistent with my brewing because we do such small brewing, and I have a lot of control over the process.
Yeah, and the other, what's beneficial is, Bradley doesn't just get to see the specific gravity, right? He can see clarity differences, he can see differences in the fermentation profile, and even temperature differences, right? Because, the way that we ferment is, because it's small batches, it's not a very big mass, right? So it's sensitive to temperature changes more so than, like a much larger batch of beer. So seeing all that other data along with that outside of gravity is also helpful, at least for me, as I'm watching the data from afar, because I'm not, brewing it or keeping an eye on the gravity in that way. But, I always kind of analyze the data, and it's gotten to the point now where when we brew a beer a lot, I can just look at the fermentation profile and the clarity, and then I can message Brad and say, hey, is that thing done? And he'll say, yeah, it's done. So there's, a lot more that, we can glean from the process than just a gravity measurement.
Yeah, when I know that there's a big range, obviously one of the things that I do in my side job by doing my interviews is really talking to different levels of brewers all over the country, now actually a little bit all over the world. And I know that what I see is a lot of different understanding of what those differences mean. So could you maybe speak to what like a 3-degree swing in temperature could do on an active fermentation?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is it changes the flavor profile, right? It's going to stress out the yeast differently, and it's going to change the compounds that they put out. So it's going to change what you pick up in your sensory tests, And for a lot of ales and lagers too, that's really critical if you want repeatability. You want the stressing of your yeast to be as, similar, as exact each time as it can possibly be. And one of the things that AccuBrew provides is you get to see that fermentation curve, not just in spots, but that actual curve. So if one batch to the other, that curve is almost, spot on. Those beers are going to be consistent and similar to what you want them to be. And also, if it starts to, your yeast starts to get a little old and it starts lagging, that fermentation curve is going to change, and you're going to know, not only sensory, but with actual data, look, something's going on here. It's taken longer to ferment out, which means my yeast is being stressed differently than it was last time. We need to take a more in-depth look, do some comparisons to previous batches, and make a decision. Do we up our temperature a little bit? Do we lower our temperature a little bit to try to slow down and stress our yeast a little bit? So it gives you the ability to actually make those decisions based on actual actionable data rather than kind of a guess.
Yeah, and you'll get that information maybe at 8 in the morning instead of waiting for somebody to take a test at 1 in the afternoon every day. Or you'll get that information on a Saturday night, and maybe you decide to go in on a Sunday instead of waiting until that test is taken on a Monday, and you can try to head off some problems earlier. Another big thing with the hydrometers is, you can give the same hydrometer to 5 people and you're going to get 5 different answers. And hopefully, one of them is going to be reasonably accurate. But the other thing that I've had happen is we had an assistant brewer who would be afraid to give bad results to the brewer. If he would give him the number that he thought he expected to see, and or he would not take the test that day, and then fill it in with the number he expected to see. So there was no real proof that he was getting semi-accurate. He was getting no data at all, you know. So it was with this thing, it's the same device taking the same measurements with the same consistent results 96 times a day, 7 days a week. You don't have to rely on people remembering what to do, or they broke the last hydrometer in the building, or dropped the last easy dins you had, and you don't get any tests at all for 3 or 4 days until you get another one mailed in. So
Yeah, it removes that human inconsistency and error potential from those measurements.
Well, and what would you say would be a worst case scenario? So let's say that a guy's writing it down on a clipboard, and like you said, he's afraid to put that he screwed up, and so what he puts the wrong gravity, writes that it's finished, it's not finished. To me, that's obvious, but maybe not to everybody. What's that potential pitfall of that happening?
Well, I mean, the idea that thousands of dollars are riding on your trust of one person to accurately take a test and then accurately record the information is when you no longer have to. For literally, parts of a penny, every test happens every day, and you don't have to worry about it, and they don't have to worry about it, and they don't have to feel guilty when it's not right or when it's perfect. They don't,
Yeah, and worst case scenario is your customer buys a set of your cans off the shelf and it tastes like garbage this time, right? And he never comes back.
Yeah, or it tastes different every single time, right? It's the same beer, but it's never the same. And that is going to be an issue for any brewery that wants consistency and to keep loyal customers coming back for that specific beer. I mean, that's the worst case, right? Like, oh, I have this IPA, and every single time it tastes different. Who's going to return to your brewery to get that beer if it's a different beer every single time?
Yeah.
Or your cans could explode.
Yeah, or your cans could explode as well. Absolutely.
We were talking to the owner of a local brewery, and his past is in the restaurant industry, and he always told his employees, he said, if they hated it the last time they were here, they better hate it this time too. So it's kind of a backwards way of saying, I just want it the same every time. I want my customers to trust what they're getting, and we know that, you in your book talk about that, where it's not critical that we make the best friggin' beer in the world, but it is critical that we make the same beer every time. And then if we can improve, we improve. But,
I mean, you got to figure out your baseline, right? Everybody needs a baseline so that you can then determine if you can incrementally improve from that point, right? But if you don't measure that baseline, and you don't know what it is, and you don't have a comparison to what you're doing now to what you started doing, then you have no idea if you're actually improving, right? So
yeah, and I'm sure there's at least 4 or 5 different seminars over the last few days, and then maybe even tomorrow, that they're going to talk about how to make your beer more consistent and where you should get your ingredients from and how you should manage your process. And it's strange that I think more people want to talk about, like, how are you inspecting to make sure that it fell through the way that you wanted it to? And that's an important part of what I think the whole system does. But maybe could one of you guys speak to what the interface looks like? I know we're not really gonna be able to show it in this situation, but when people think of just a temp probe in the tank, but what they're gonna see is something different on phone or desktop. Like what are they getting as a daily thing from AccuBrew?
Okay, so on desktop, you get your 4 values, right? You have a dashboard. You select the probe or the batch that you want to view. You get your 4 readings, right? You get your deltas on those readings, right? Whether it's gone up or gone down from the previous few hours, and then you get graphs, so you can see your entire trend line from start to where you are currently, right? So then you can visually compare your SG to your firm profile, to your clarity, to your temperature. And then, you also get your brew book. So whether you've added notes, process notes, or your assistant has added process notes, you can look and see, okay, well, my assistant brewer made this observation. He thought something seemed a little bit off, so we made a note. Let me verify. And also part of that is you can see process reminders, right? So if you want to make sure that you're doing a hop or an addition, or you want to crash at this particular time on this day, you get to set that alert, and you have, a full list of your upcoming alerts, your past alerts, and things like that. The team message board, right? So you have safe, private communication, with everyone on the team, so everybody's always aware of what's going on. And that's kind of the dashboard. And then, there are, in the batches tab, you can view every batch you've ever run. You can see the graphs, the notes, the reminders, the alerts. So you have all that sort of at your fingertips on web. And the mobile apps are a little bit pared down at this point, right? So you get your 4 values, right? You can see the changes in it. You can see your messages, and you can see your brew book. The only thing you don't get on mobile right now is the graphs.
Yeah, what's interesting, because I know pretty much every owner I know will log in and look at what their tasting room revenue is on 3 o'clock on a Saturday without having to be there. But we don't have that paradigm that they should also be logging in to look at the fermentation profiles of their tanks and how close they are on Monday or whatever when they're not there, which I think is an important piece of the puzzle, like I said. So
yeah, and on Saturday, if you've set your temperature thresholds, your min and your max, if it escapes those boundaries, you're going to get a push notification. And if you have added your brewer or your assistant brewer or whoever, and they will also get those push notifications. So, even say it's a Saturday and you're not there as the owner, but your assistant brewer is there doing something, he can immediately get eyes on and see, what the root cause of that is and take care of it, rather than it waiting till Monday when somebody shows up.
yeah, so I think the obvious use case is, and we're kind of talking about the brewer who's learning how to make his beer, or her, I should say, their beer correctly and repeatably. But let's play devil's advocate for a second. Like, what about the guy who says, I've been making the same beer for 10 years. What the hell do I need this product for? I already know how to make it. What do you say to that guy?
I always think about what Brad has said and other people that I've, the only person that's sure of their temperature is the person with one thermometer. And if you're at the point where you're not improving and changing and growing as a brewer, and you're doing nothing new, that kind of implies to me you're not doing anything new. You're not going to keep up with this industry. This industry is changing way too fast for that. The beers that are profitable today or even marketable today were not the same beers that people were selling and making and selling 10 years ago, when the biggest thing you could get was a hoppy IPA. Well, now you're going to be making a seltzer maybe, or a cider, God forbid. So that might be well and good for what you've been doing for 10 years on the exact same system, running day in, day out. But that's not going to help you keep up with the market. It's not going to help you stay ahead of the market. So stay behind if you want, but there's a lot of new stuff coming. I always say, whether it's us or anybody else, this type of thing is unavoidable. The idea that there would be something you can hold in your hands that is going to replace. Think back, like you were saying earlier. Think back in time when you probably gave the first guy a hydrometer. He probably laughed at him. He's like, what the hell do I need that before? I've been making beer for 200 years. Why do I need what's gravity? Why do I need to know that? So I think that there'll be a generation of brewers one day that won't even, they'll be just like young people I know now who can't imagine a world without a computer in their pocket, so.
Yeah, I think my question for that brewer who would say that would be, well, how do you know that? How do you actually know that? Like, one of the first things you kind of learn of when you are learning how to taste beer and do sensory panels is confirmation bias. You know, are you actually trying to get past your own confirmation bias? Is there a way that you are actually quantifying that this is the same beer every time? Or is that just something in the back of your head that, oh yeah, it's the same every time because, you know, that's just what you believe? Anybody who's really striving to improve their product in manufacturing is going to want quantifiable data, not just, my assumption that could be affected by confirmation bias, because that's a real thing and it happens to every brewer, including home brewers.
Yeah, and process drift is a thing, right? If the changes are very small, but they're incremental over 18 months, right? You're not going to be able to recognize that from batch to batch. You're just going to know when it's bad enough for you to recognize, right? But if you've been tracking that data the whole time, right, it's going to be an indicator in there that, all right, well, something's changing a little bit, so maybe I should take a look at this and try to fine tune things a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think it gives you the opportunity to see it coming better too. So again, if you're using sensory analysis, then once you sense it, it's too late. It's already there. But if you can tell that your temperature is going up or that your gravity is different, and not moving on the wrong thing, and so maybe your yeast is tiring out and you need to come in there early and do something with it before it changes, you can fix the problem before it's a problem, I guess. And that, I think, is a big part of how many times does it sense it in a day?
96, yeah.
All right, that's a lot. I don't know how many times that is per hour, but it's a lot. So
well, and more importantly, we're a visible light sensor. We're the only one like that. And I think once people every time I show the data to people, when they look at the gravity profile, it's it's generally a pretty smooth slope that you might want to snowboard down and, as a beginner. And then you look at the clarity profile, and that starts to show you things that nobody has ever seen inside these tanks before. That gravity could have, pretty much leveled off at the end of the process. And meanwhile, and lager brewers know this, there is a lot going on in that tank for days, weeks afterwards, and the clarity profile starts to show that. And every time they see that, they're mind blown. They're like, I had no idea. And I think until you see that the first time, it's going to do the same thing it did to me. It's like, wow, we know these changes are happening, but there's no evidence of them, and there's no evidence if you're not doing those tests, which few people are, they're limiting themselves to basically two tests, pH and gravity. And this is showing some really dynamic activity inside the tank. And by comparing those runs, you can infer a lot of information from that as to how consistent these two batches were.
Yeah, and it's always interesting for me personally to see kind of how sawtooth everyone's temperature profile is, right? And so maybe you walk by your fermenter and you have your temperature display and it always says 68.1 degrees every time you walk by it. But, the times you're not walking by it, it could be 72, or 64, and it's interesting to see, talk to people and say, oh, my temperature's dialed in. It never drifts at all. And, that's not how solutions work, right? That temperature is not homogeneous through the whole thing. It's just not the reality, right? So there's always some movement with convection and that kind of thing. And it's kind of like a moment when people go, oh, wow, I had no idea that I was getting that much temperature differential in my fermentation process.
30-degree liquid, yeah, it won't cool efficiently. It's gonna drop, come back up, and so or it won't cool evenly, I guess.
Yeah, and in one of our first test breweries, Bradley was talking to the brewer, and they had these big pull-up garage doors that face the east, right? And their fermenters were right behind those. And, so they'd get these huge, like 6 or 7 degree temperature swings as the sun came up, right? And then when it set, and it would drop back down, and they had no idea, right? So their displays on their fermenters were, every time they walked by it, it was the right temp, but they would get huge temperature swings in fermentations.
Yeah. So obviously, major advantages of just things you don't know. I would say most people are going to be concerned in the sense that this is so technological, so easy to use, and so on the money as far as when it communicates with you. It's got to be expensive. Parker, is it expensive?
No. That was the big goal here, was that the system wasn't going to do anyone any good if they could only afford to put one sensor in the brewery. That you needed to monitor every tank, every batch, every time. And they have got this thing in ridiculously affordable. And on top of that, the subscriptions are, I did one analysis to one other competitor, and I could put 10 of our sensors in for less than the price of 4 of theirs over a 5-year period. So, instead of monitoring four tanks and a few batches a year, you could monitor 10 tanks. So maybe if you're doing 20 turns, 200 batches a year as opposed to maybe 80. So, right, 20, 10, 200, yeah.
All right. So from an implementation perspective, like how does it work? Is it just you guys ship it in the mail, I plug it in, and I walk away? Like, how do I make this make better beer in my brewery?
Yeah, you go to the website, AccuBrew.io, you place your order, get your sensors. Brad has put a little QR code on the face of every one. Download, install your app for Apple or Android. Plug the sensor in and scan that QR code, and it will attach that to your account. Let's see, you got to get your subscription first. I always mix these up. So once you have the code scanned, then you assign a subscription to each one of those. The first one is only $25. Each one after that's only $10. So it makes it affordable to put his sensor in every tank. And you're really pretty much done at that point.
Yeah, if you have
with the setup,
go through the claim process, and you're off to the races.
Yeah. All right. And who's gonna help me set it up? Am I calling somebody in India to answer my questions, or is it one of you guys?
You don't even need us. In theory, you shouldn't need anybody. It's really that straightforward.
Yeah, but if you do need us, we're
here
in Oldsmar, Florida.
Yeah,
so.
I like to say we're never more than 3 time zones away. And we have a lifetime warranty, including shipping both ways so far. See how long that lasts. And, God knows. But because it is kind of a bulletproof device. I mean, there's really very little that can go wrong with it unless you smash it on the floor. And we've had a couple of people do that, but, we took care of them. So.
All right. So obviously, if they're at CBC, I imagine that they can walk by the booth and go pick one up. Otherwise, go to the website, call you, Smoke Signals? How do they get one?
Go to the website, AccuBrew.io. We have an awesome strategy guide. We have a lot of resources on there to learn more about the system, learn more about our company. And we will be at booth 320 in the Brew Expo America Conference Center. And we are going to be doing our seminar in, Casanova Room Tuesday, starting at 11, I believe, 11, room 507, I think. So, and there'll be a Q&A, or like I said, you can stop by the booth and meet these guys because they're going to be there answering anybody's questions.
Yep, Bradley and I will be there, and we love to talk about science stuff. So.
And beer. I love talking about beer.
Beer and science.
We do. Yeah.
Great. Well, I look forward to coming and doing the live presentation while we're there. It's going to be exciting, and I think we're going to definitely change craft beer for the better with this product. I think it's a fantastic addition to the industry, and appreciate you guys making it. Appreciate you guys selling it, and inviting me to come hang out with you. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, we're excited. We can't wait to be in Vegas and have a good time and sell some sensors. Any final thoughts besides yay Vegas?
No. Punk Rock Museum. Looking forward to that.
The Sphere.
Got one thing on my agenda.
I actually decided that I was going to start my trip on Sunday. So I'm coming out there Saturday. I rented a Porsche, and I'm driving to LA to pick my brother up and do a Fear and Loathing drive into Vegas, and then he's flying
Hell
out,
yeah.
and I'm gonna do the show with you guys.
Dude.
Very
Oh,
nice.
there's gonna be 2 of you guys? Oh man, we're in trouble.
So be ready. So if you want to have some fun, we are going to a concert Saturday night. We will probably sleep in Sunday, but we have to have some fun Sunday too. So I'd offer to help set up the booth, but I don't think I'm gonna be in any condition to do so. So I'll show up though.
We got that part. All right. Well, thanks, man. Appreciate you being on. I can't wait to see you.
Take care.
Later,
Good.
guys. Appreciate you.
I'd like to thank you again for joining us for the AccuBrew webinar today. If you happen to be at CBC and you were not able to attend our live seminar today, please stop by our booth 320 in the expo hall. If you weren't able to attend CBC, please check out our socials pages as well as our website, AccuBrew.io. Welcome to the AccuBrew family.